Imagine you're sitting in your car. It's late. The world outside is swallowed by the dark, and the only light is the faint glow of your dashboard. It's an ordinary night, the kind of night you've experienced 1,000 times before, until you hear it. A knock at your window. It's not aggressive, it's hesitant, soft. Your first instinct is to help, but before you even turn your head, a heavy, cold dread settles in the pit of your stomach. A primal warning from the oldest part of your brain, screaming at you that something is horribly wrong. You look. Standing outside your glass are two children. They look lost. They are pale, dressed in simple, outdated clothes. They ask to come in. They say they need a ride.
Welcome back to Jekyll's Journal.
Tonight, we aren't talking about ghosts that haunt old mansions or cryptids hiding in the deep woods. We are talking about a phenomenon that comes directly to your front door. A predator that relies on your compassion to survive. But what happens when you finally look closely at these children? And more importantly, what happens if you make the mistake of saying yes? When we think of children, we conjure up images of innocence, warmth, and security. We are biologically programmed to protect them, and that is exactly what makes this phenomenon so profoundly disturbing. It weaponizes our deepest human instincts against us. Before we uncover what these things are, we have to look at how they operate. And to do that, we have to go back to 1996, to an empty parking lot in Abilene, Texas. A journalist named Brian Bethel was sitting in his car, using the light from a nearby movie theater marquee to write a check. It was a quiet night. Suddenly, a tap on his window shattered the calm. Standing outside were two boys, perhaps 10 or 12 years old. One was olive-skinned with curly hair. The other was pale and freckled. They wore hooded pullovers, partially obscuring their faces. The boy spoke. But his voice, it lacked the normal inflection of a child. It was flat, rehearsed, like an actor reading a script they didn't fully understand.
"We want to go to the movie," the boy said. "But we left our money at our mother's house. We just need a ride."
It was a simple request, but Bethel felt an immediate, overwhelming rush of terror. It was a fear so profound, it was almost paralyzing. Bethel glanced at the theater marquee. The movie they wanted to see was already well underway. It would be nearly over by the time they returned. It was a crack in their story. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear, Bethel felt an unexplainable, hypnotic pull toward them. His hand, seemingly acting on its own, began reaching for the door lock. Why? Why would a grown man feel compelled to unlock his door when every fiber of his being was screaming at him to drive away? The boy continued his appeal, his voice growing more insistent. "It will only take a moment. We're just two little kids. We don't have a gun or anything." It was that phrase that finally broke the spell. What child talks like that? Bethel finally snapped his gaze away from the boy's face and looked directly into his eyes. They were coal black. There was no pupil, no iris, no white of the sclera. They were just soulless orbs that seemed to absorb the light from the theater marquee, reflecting absolutely nothing back. Bethel panicked. He pulled his hand away from the lock. The moment he did, the boy's mask of politeness vanished. The voice dropped its innocent act, replaced by something forceful, angry, and demanding. "Let us in," the things demanded. "We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay." Let us in! Bethel slammed his car into gear and sped away. When he looked in his rearview mirror moments later, the empty street was completely devoid of life. The children were gone. Bethel had survived because he recognized a fundamental rule of this phenomenon, a rule as old as folklore itself. They must be invited in. It's easy to dismiss a story from the 90s, to write it off as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. But what happens when the knocking moves from an isolated parking lot to the front door of your own home? A few years ago, a couple living in the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods of Houston, Texas, experienced this exact nightmare. It was a slow evening. The husband had gone to bed early, leaving his wife in the living room with their dog, watching television. Around 10:30 p.m., the silence of the house was broken by a sharp rap at the front door. Instantly, the family dog, a usually calm and docile golden retriever, sprinted to the back door, clawing at the wood in a state of absolute frantic panic. Animals have a way of sensing things that our rational minds try to ignore. They can sense a predator. Confused, the woman walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on her porch were a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been older than 10. A heavy dread immediately dropped into her stomach. Something felt fundamentally wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. She opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain engaged. The children just stared at her blankly. "Are you lost?" she asked. The little girl looked up. Her voice had a strange, rhythmic, almost mechanical quality to it. "We need to call our mother. Please let us inside." The woman asked why they didn't just use their cell phones. The two children slowly turned their heads to look at each other, perfectly synchronized, before turning back to the woman. "Our battery died," the boy said. It was then that the little girl stepped forward, out of the shadows, and into the amber glow of the porch light. The woman's breath hitched in her throat. The girl had no irises, no whites in her eyes, just an empty, pitch-black void where the sparkling eyes of a child should have been. The woman slammed the door, bolted the deadbolt, and backed away, listening in horror as the children stood on the porch, their voices losing their monotonous tone, now pleading and crying to be let inside. She survived. She kept the door closed. But what if she hadn't? What happens when human compassion overrides our primal instincts? What happens when you open the door wide and tell them to come in? In the winter of 2015, we got our answer. In a rural town in Vermont, an elderly couple was abruptly woken at 2 a.m. by a loud bang at their front door. Outside, a brutal snowstorm was raging. Assuming a stranded motorist needed emergency help, the couple rushed downstairs. When they opened the door, they found a young boy and girl. Neither was dressed for the freezing winter weather, and both had strange, outdated haircuts. The couple felt unnerved. But their maternal and paternal instincts kicked in. Seeing 2 freezing children in a blizzard, they ignored the sinking feeling in their guts and invited the children inside to get warm. The moment the children crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the house changed. The couple's 4 cats, usually incredibly affectionate, began hissing violently at the children, their fur standing on end. The couple offered to make the kids warm drinks, asking them where their parents were. The children didn't make eye contact. They simply responded in a bizarre, sing-song voice, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Our parents will be here soon. As the husband handed the drinks to the children, a wave of intense dizziness washed over him. He looked down at the kids. They finally looked up at him. Their eyes were completely black. No soul, just a dark pit of nothing. The husband stumbled backward, clutching his face as a sudden violent nosebleed erupted. He had never suffered from nosebleeds in his life. His wife, rushing to help him, began to feel violently ill and dizzy herself. Suddenly, the power in the entire house cut out. Plunged into darkness, the wife looked down the hallway. The children were standing perfectly still in the shadows. "Our parents have arrived," one of them said. They walked out the open front door and stepped into the blizzard. The wife, terrified, looked out the window. Idling at the end of their driveway was a pitch-black car. Standing beside it were two exceptionally tall men, dressed in immaculate black suits. The men and the children got into the car and vanished into the storm. If the story ended there, it would just be a bizarre encounter. But it's the aftermath that truly reveals what these entities are. Over the next few months, the couple's cats began to disappear. The cat that had hissed at the children the loudest was found dead on the living room floor in a pool of its own blood, killed by a sudden, massive internal hemorrhage. The wife continued to suffer from chronic dizzy spells and extreme fatigue. And her husband? The man who had handed the children their drinks. He developed an incredibly aggressive, terminal form of skin cancer. It was a specific type of cancer, usually associated with heavy radiation exposure. A man who spent the long Vermont winters entirely indoors. By inviting them in, the couple hadn't just welcomed a ghost. They had invited an infection. A plague of misfortune, decay, and death that wore away at their health from the inside out. So, what exactly is knocking at our doors? Some believe they are a modern interpretation of the vampire. Throughout history and folklore, predatory entities have often taken the form of something innocent, like a child, to make their victims vulnerable. Like the vampires of old European lore, these beings are entirely powerless against a locked door. They require your verbal consent to cross the threshold. Others point to the men in black, seen in the Vermont case, suggesting a connection to extraterrestrials. The illness suffered by the husband, the sudden nosebleeds, the aggressive cancer, matches the symptoms of acute radiation poisoning. Ufologists call this moonburn syndrome, an illness reported by people who have come into close proximity with alien spacecraft. Are these children some sort of alien-human hybrid, attempting to assimilate into our society? Or perhaps the explanation is purely biological. Roboticists have a term called the Uncanny Valley. It's the profound sense of revulsion we feel when we look at something that is almost perfectly human, but not quite. These entities are a near-perfect mimicry of a child, but their monotonous voices, their pale skin, and their terrifying void-like eyes are glitches in the simulation. When you look into their eyes, your brain receives two conflicting signals. The shape of the face says, "Child, protect." But the black voids say, "Predator, danger." This conflict short-circuits our minds, resulting in the paralyzing dread that every single witness reports. The black-eyed children have been seen in Texas, in Vermont, in the remote woods of Cannock Chase in England, and on isolated reservations in South Dakota. They are everywhere. They don't break windows. They don't pick locks. They simply knock, and they wait. They prey on our empathy. They use our own humanity as a weapon against us. But there is one final, terrifying rule to their mythology. A piece of viral code attached to their legend. They say that the black-eyed children only come to those who know about them. Once you become aware of their existence, they become aware of yours. So tonight, when you turn off your screen and the house goes quiet, if you hear a soft, hesitant tap at your front door, do yourself a favor. Do not look out the window. And whatever you do not let them in. If you've had a strange or unexplainable encounter, leave it in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Jekyll's Journal for more stories of the mysterious and the macabre. Stay safe out there, and remember, the more you know, the more there is to fear.